theme is present in all prose writing and is a message the author wants to bring forward within the text to the reader. A theme can usually come in the form of a message the writer wishes to speak about within a prose format through the use of plot, characters, and setting. These aspects of writing all form an idea of the story in the reader's mind, and how they will imagine aspects of the story which can be developed to represent certain themes within the writing. This is done through an incorporation of symbolism, a subtle use of description that brings particular details to the reader's attention, and the use of characters and their thoughts being used to reflect on certain ideas within their own world. Writers use these techniques to then compare and contrast on certain themes, causing the readers to be aware of themes within the novel or creative piece they are reading. The example I'm using is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman, which won the Locus Award for Best Fantasy Novel in 2014 and was nominated for the Nebula Award for Best Novel in 2014. The novel starts with an unnamed protagonist who left a funeral and drove to his old house where he and his sister lived, when he remembers a friend of his from when he was 7 years old, Letty Hempstock. The protagonist recounts his memories of what happened to Letty when he visits her old house at the end of the lane. These recollections also include the story of how the protagonist survived his youth while being tormented by creatures of another world and facing his fears as death began to become an imminent possibility for him. This book is most commonly referred to as a dark fantasy novel, though it does blend into other genres such as surrealism and horror, which makes it unique in not only story but the way Neil Gaiman uses theme. The Ocean at the End of the Lane heavily uses theme to explore mortality and how children develop identity with adult figures constantly being present. Even though The Ocean at the End of the Lane is quite original in content, Neil Gaiman manages to use techniques to his advantage and highlights the themes in a very subtle way, which the reader may not notice at first, because of the way he's decided to use description within this novel. With the theme of mortality, Neil Gaiman uses the story to focus on death. He mainly does this through description. His descriptions tend to be grim and dark. For instance, the main character focuses mainly on death, which is done in small sentences or paragraphs over and over again throughout the novel. Gaiman repeatedly references death very early on in the story to cement the ideas, no matter how small of a detail it seemed or how minimal of an impact it made to the overall story. It creates an impact on the reader when the story becomes clearer. As this novel is very surrealist in nature, the story isn't automatically apparent. Descriptions were often grim, dark colors such as grey, black, blue, and red were often to describe a whole array of objects throughout the novel. It varied from clothes to the outdoors to the creatures he began to see. Dark colors weren't always used. A representation of life was also commonly used through green. Here is an example of Neil Gaiman using these techniques to implement the theme of mortality. There I said, fascinated, the corpse of a very small animal, a vole, by the look of it, lay on a clump of green moss. It had no head, and bright blood stained its fur and beaded on the moss. It was very red. He also used a lack of description to create an emotional response to death in some parts of the novel, which can be seen in this excerpt. The kitten slept on my pillow, and it even waited for me to come home from school, sitting on the driveway in front of my house by the fence until a month later it was run over by a taxi that brought the opal miner to stay. The opal miner, the main character, barely knew, even commits suicide, and this is a conversation between the main character and his friend. I said, "There is a dead man in our car. Do you think he killed himself?" "Yes. Do you like milk? Gran's milking Bessie now." This conversation comes across as normal for these characters because of how nonchalant they are about the idea of death. Having the main character be a 7-year-old boy creates an innocence about the protagonist and therefore impacts on his view of death, as children don't usually understand the concept of it until later on in life. This is an example of how you can use characters and how you develop them as writers to project a message within your writing. The little moments of odd description and detail included in the plot were all building up to the theme of mortality and how it can not only affect your life but also how easily death can happen. The main character's view of death in the beginning is detrimental to the theme of mortality because the author decides to use this character in a way to explicitly show their views of death. It exemplifies how the characters develop throughout the story on this theme when compared to his views of it towards the end of the story, which is illuminated to the reader more openly. I was a normal child, which is to say I was selfish and I was not entirely convinced of the existence of things that were not me, and I was certain, rock solid, unshakably certain, that I was the most important thing in creation. There was nothing more important to me than I was. Even so, I understood what I was seeing. The hunger birds would. No, they were ripping the world away, tearing it into nothing. Soon there would be no world. My mother, my father, my sister, my house, my school, friends, my town, my grandparents, London. Because of me, all these things would be gone, and there would be nothing in their place. I did not want to die. I did not want to die at all. Understand that. Using plot and character to portray messages to readers is an advantage to writers because of how it can be used in several different aspects of a story. This creates an image for readers that can be understood through the way certain techniques are used. Here's an example of how I've used these techniques to influence the theme in my own work. This is in the middle of the story, where in a diary entry set in the 1800s, surrounding a more fantasy element where the main character is a hunter aiming to kill fantasy creatures in order to help people. The creature became stiff before me. I heard my father's voice behind me. "I knew you couldn't do it. You're just like your mother." He said it in such a way that made me feel ill. He spat out the word mother in poisonous spite. It bothered me that he put my It bothered me that he put my mother down. Maybe my mother wanted to help the Leshy. My father hated the Leshy because they always ended up slaughtering people who wandered into their domain. You heard it, it's willing to kill anyone who wanders here, my father taught me about how Leshy since I was a little girl. He told me Leshy only ever killed people who walked into their territory. They ripped people apart like savage animals. But he also said they were too strong to fight. Magic flowed through them. A strong exterior of bone and wood made them impervious to most weapons. The only way to stop them was to shoot them in the eye, which most times you couldn't even see as the eyes were permeated in darkness. I was always wrought with anxiety that my father wouldn't come home. He noticed this one day and said, "The Leshy aren't smart creatures. They're unintelligent animals. That's all they are. People are smart. Hunters are smart. I will come home every time, I can promise you that." Knowing this made my heart sink a little. As a child I loved him, yes, but I also hated him for beating me every time something went wrong for him. If I made one tiny mistake, he hurt me. I wondered if he even loved me at all, or if he wanted to use me as a puppet to become this bloodthirsty hunter. People always noticed the bruises he left on me, even as a child. When I got older, it only got worse. I'd have a black eye and no one would care as I walked down the street. Even other hunters wouldn't do anything to help me. I was on my own the moment my mother passed away. I was just a replacement for her after she died. I always knew he wanted a son, but he couldn't have one. I always felt as though her death came out of nowhere. I even asked my father how she died, and all he did was scream at me to never ask that again. I panicked. "It didn't kill those people. You were wrong about everything. They aren't savage animals. They are protective and intelligent creatures." Instead of listening to me, he fired an arrow right into the deep hollow of its eye. I felt my cheeks burn. The main theme I've used within this piece is morality, as I wanted to explore the morally grey character within the era of the 1800s, which was often a time where good and evil characters are seen as being completely separate. They were either good or evil, and not often a mixture of both. I've done this by highlighting certain features within the plot and characters the most, rather than using description for that purpose. Techniques used to write in a theme does not always need to be used. It all depends on the type of story a writer is aiming to create. My aim is to explore the character more than anything else, which is why though in my excerpt it is not apparent here, it is written as a diary entry from the main character's point of view in order to reveal more of her complicated nature and what her morals are through her thoughts and actions. I've used backstory to highlight her feelings about her father and the complexities of the Leshy's own morality to accentuate this theme and what she believes is right and wrong, which can be seen through what she says and does. Theme is often complicated to incorporate into a piece of writing, but there are several ways to do so, which has been shown here. The techniques used to create a theme in a piece can be extensive if it's a longer piece of work, but by using plot, character setting and description, as long as it has been well thought out, how to incorporate a message, it can come across quite well, like in Ocean at the End of the Line. Theme can be brought out in a work subtly or overtly, but it depends on what the writer wants from the story they are creating. It just depends on their own style of writing and the stories they like to create. Thank you.